In this video, I'm going to show you how to draw long fur with colored pencils. So the first thing you're going to want to do is take one of the darker colors that you have for whichever fur type that you're drawing. One of the darker colors being you've picked a bunch of colors to use to create the fur that you are drawing with whatever drawing you're drawing. You can draw it with this one or other furs, but it all usually applies the same. So you want to take that darker color and sketch in kind of a rough shadow shape of all of the different variations of shadow shapes in the fur. And then you're going to want to take one of your lightest colors, so a color you've picked out that matches kind of the highlights of the type of fur that you're drawing, and you're going to lightly go over, well, it's not a super light layer, but add like between a medium and light layer, and get all of this into your drawing to begin with to get yourself a good base layer. If you didn't do any of the dark shadowy shapes first, this would make drawing fur really hard for you. Really, the key to getting this right is making sure that you have those shapes in there to help you figure out where everything else needs to be. So you'll see me, I have already gone through and added in those darker sections. It's not entirely, you're not drawing hairs, you're trying to focus on shapes. The entire time you're drawing pretty much any drawing is trying to get shapes in. You're not worried about trying to do what the actual object is. So I've got my base layer of the shadows in. I've gone over with a light layer, and then I went over it with a darker color after that light layer of the color that was closest to the highlights. With the darker layer, I focused adding this into the areas that are darkest in the reference photo that you see. And now I'm going to take another layer of the darker color, which would be brown. For this fur, you want to stick with warm colors, which would be the reds. Possibly, you could use some yellow in there if you were experienced enough and using only minimal colors. However, in this case, I am only using shades of red, as well as the shadows will need to be brown. And I am starting to block in some of the darker sections to these shadows, just because the first initial layer with the dark color was just to give myself kind of a idea of where everything needs to be, so that when I filled in with all of the reds, I didn't end up losing my sketch. So now I'm going to blend all of this out with odorless mineral spirits, and that really is kind of the best method, in my opinion, to blending with colored pencils. Ideally, with colored pencils, you do a combination. You do some solvent blending, and then you do burnish blending for other effects as well. But essentially, one of the keys to drawing realistic hair or fur is actually using odorless mineral spirits to blend out your first base layer and making sure that all of the pigments get absorbed into the paper and it gets rid of all of the whites of the paper. Then when you apply layers over the top of it later, it is easy to start adding special little effects to the fur to help yourself out, instead of trying to painstakingly draw every single detail. You still have to draw a lot of details, but you're not going to be stressing yourself out trying to draw everything with the pencils. So the tool that I like to use, which I will be using here briefly in a little bit, is called a slice tool. You can use an X-Acto knife, but a slice tool actually works a little bit better. I will have a link in the description to all of the supplies that I use for my drawings, including the slice tool, in case you want to check that out for yourself and use it for your colored pencil work. I definitely recommend getting at least the slice tool to help yourself out with drawing fur or hair. This could be classified as hair as well, but it is fur. It's from a cow, actually. But Now what you see me doing is I've got that base layer all blended out with odorless mineral spirits, and I have allotted at least 15 minutes to dry before I am adding any of these layers right now over the top of that. You want to at least 15 minutes for it to dry because you don't want to add any layers of colored pencil on wet paper because you could indent the paper and damage it, which would prevent you from being able to add effective layers over the top of it later. So now I am working in another layer of my darker red color into the fur, and I'm focusing on putting this in the areas on the reference photo that you saw earlier in where it is darker. And I am trying to bleed over into some of the areas where they are, or maybe a little bit more highlighted as in the reference photo, because I want to use that slice tool to scrape off the top layer to help myself out in creating fur. And the best way to do that is to make sure you get a larger fill in of the layers so that when you scrape off, you're leaving what you would end up calling kind of not entirely the darkest shadows, but you would be leaving behind midtones with this red, or even some areas it may be kind of shadowy. But you'll be doing that with the entirety of everything that you build up. And the easiest way to do that is to get all of your values as accurate as you can before you start scraping. So take your time to fill in and try to get all of the entirety of areas filled in, especially your shadows. The shadows really are the most important factor to try and get accurate. Your highlights and midtones don't matter so much, and especially the color. Color is not important when you're drawing fur, but you want to try and get all of those shadows in, because when you scrape off, essentially you kind of want to be in a place where your drawing or the area that you're working on in your drawing is going to be done or almost done when you start scraping. So that way when you come back through, you're only making minimal adjustments, adding some color differences or changing the values a little bit. And by I mean changing values, I mean darkening them. So that way you're not trying to lighten anything up and having to erase and then redo all of the processes you've done. Because let's face it, erasers just aren't as thin as you can get in a pencil stroke of a sharp pencil, that is, or a slice tool or an X-Acto knife. So you want to make sure you have all of those shadows as close as you can to being accurate before you start scraping. Now you've seen me build up the red layers. I've covered a lot of what will be the highlights because, like I said, I want to make sure all of my midtones and shadows are very well built up before I start scraping. So I did build in all of my midtones. Now I'm using black because I do have two heavy layers of a dark brown on there to get the kind of reddish brown tones in first before I start using black. When you're drawing fur or anything general, you don't want to start using black to shade with right away because then your drawing will look very unrealistic. You need to be using different colors or browns, or even some types of fur you'd be using darker shades of gray to build up all of your shadows and get them almost as dark as you can with those colors before you start using black. I always say that black should be saved for last and used as kind of the final touch to get your darks as dark as they need to be. And the one thing with black is that it's very easy to accidentally end up adding too much of it, so you want to make sure that you're trying to apply it very minimally with super, super light layers. Now, as I'm building these shadows with the black, there are some areas where there isn't quite as much brown, and this is part of the process of drawing fur, and that, it's not perfect. You're never going to perfectly execute any of your drawings, the processes, or anything. There may be times when you fill something in and you feel like it looks good, but then later on you find that you didn't quite evaluate things correctly and have to make adjustments. So throughout your whole drawing process, you're going to be analyzing everything that you do, and just don't get too frustrated with it not looking like you want it to. Just think about how you could change it to get the effect you want. A lot of artwork is technically not finished until you decide it is, until you've gone through the loops of trying to figure out what you could do to change something maybe you don't like, or just leaving something the way it is and accepting that it isn't perfect, but it looks decent. And sometimes fur can be really, really frustrating to draw. So if you find yourself not liking what you're drawing, just take a break and come back to it later and reevaluate. Oftentimes, taking a break will cause you to not be stressed out about whatever you're stressing about, and you'll come back with a fresh mind and maybe be able to see something more clearly that was wrong to begin with, and you can fix it better. Whereas if you tried to just spend your time focusing on it hardcore before, you wouldn't be able to see it. So as I'm coming along here with the fur, I am trying to incorporate my strokes as a lot of building shadowy shapes. I'm not entirely worried about getting a bunch of hair thin pencil strokes. And that is one thing that I see a lot of people making the mistake of when they draw fur or hair, is that they think that it's just a bunch of hair thin pencil strokes of different colors to make up the fur or hair, and that just isn't true. If you try to draw your drawing like that and focus on drawing individual strokes for each color, you're going to end up with something that looks like very unrealistic straw. The key to making realistic fur and hair, especially long fur like this one, you could kind of get away with it with doing short fur, like you can kind of see in the left there. But what you want to be thinking about is that everything that you're trying to draw is you're trying to construct shapes. And essentially, when you're all finished with your drawing, your brain puts together all of the shapes that you see, and it makes it look realistic, or makes you think, identify what you're seeing. But when you're doing the drawing process, you don't want to think about every individual hair. You want to think about the shapes that you're building. And as you see me using the slice tool, that's essentially what is going on as well. I am kind of scraping off the top layer and building the highlights and midtones for the fur here. And I'm not trying to get individual strokes and continue those throughout the entire fur. I am focused on trying to make a bunch of strokes in one area, pulling it to a certain direction, and creating a flowing shape of multiple series of strokes that kind of overlap each other, so that there isn't any one individual hairs. And the other key to drawing realistic fur is to also think about this applies mainly to long fur. It doesn't apply so much to short fur. But long fur, you want to try and do your strokes from one point. You could start at the top and drag those strokes to scrape off the top layer and end it at the halfway mark throughout the entire strand. And then once you've done that, you can do a couple more strokes to the halfway point as well, but then you'll want to continue some strokes from kind of the same region to the end of the hair. A lot of times you may think that you need to continue from the top and all the way down to the bottom of the strip of hair, but that is essentially what I just was mentioning, that you'll end up with something looking like straw. You don't want to make continuous strokes throughout the entire length of each strip of hair, because that isn't what makes it look realistic. It's a series of different kind of highlighted midtone and shadow shapes in the hair or fur itself that makes it look like hair or fur. And depending on the lighting and the shape and angles of the fur as they turn and where the light's at, will cause highlights to appear in certain areas. And oftentimes with those highlights, you definitely don't see individual hairs with those. So you'll see me, I'm trying to create a bunch of thick strokes. I'm trying to build some structure and going off into different directions. Off in the corner, the fur underneath was kind of changing direction a lot. And then there's some fur that kind of overlaps. And this can be a little difficult with long fur to do this, because you can't draw over the top of something that needs to be on the top. So when I am dragging these strokes, I am not dragging it entirely from where the shadow starts. I'm doing it kind of halfway, and I'm actually trying to apply as minimal pressure as I can with my slice tool so that I create a very light scrape off. I leave some of the dark colors on there on that top layer, and then I start pressing a little bit more as I work my way into the lighter section, because I don't want to end up scraping off too much of that shadow, because then it would create a really harsh contrast between where the shadow's at and the start of the hair. That would make more work for me later when I have to go back over this and kind of touch up some of the scrapes offs I did and get the values accurate, and then apply some more color over the top. And as you see me doing right now, I am using the darker shade of red, and I am going over the top of these strands, and I am trying to get the values more accurate, as well as I'm adding some color in there as well. And from this point out, you may or may not scrape off more, or you may just be working in the kind of burnish blending method, which is kind of almost what I'm doing at this point. The one thing you want to keep in mind, though, with using a slice tool, and especially it depends on the kind of paper, the paper that I'm using is Bristol Vellum, and that is the most ideal kind of paper to be using for scraping off with a slice tool. If you're using more textured paper, you won't get as nice of an effect. I mean, you can still do it, but it just won't be as nice. You need a smoother paper to do that. You could probably get really great results with a plate surface, but plate just doesn't have enough tooth to grab colored pencil, whereas Bristol Vellum does. So that's another key thing to how this effect is taking place and how I'm able to get the results that I am getting. So now that I've kind of got the colors of the red more adjusted, I am using a brown to go over the top, and I am adding in some other strokes to help create some of the shadows that weren't in there before. Drawing fur is a layering process. It isn't going to be pretty straightforward. And realistically, there isn't a wrong way to do anything. There's lots of different ways. And you just need to find out which way works best for you. So now I'm going to take black again, and I am going to go over all of everything that I did with the brown first. As I said before, I'm trying to finish out the shadows after doing brown, because I want to darken everything up with a color first before I start using black. But now I'm trying to get those values to be a lot more accurate and working in some more of those shadowy shapes into this fur. And I'm just going to take my slice tool again, and I'm going to go back over some of the areas that I reapplied the colored pencil, and I'm going to scrape off some more of that top layer just to recreate some of the highlights that I wanted to be there. So now I'm more focused on trying to draw those little individual hairs that kind of crisscross over certain sections to create a little bit more of a realistic look of those flighty hairs, instead of trying to build up just a general shape of highlighted shadow, or not shadows, but the highlights and them as a shape instead of being individual hairs as I was doing before. You can watch more of my YouTube tutorials from the top right video, or you can learn how to draw wildlife and pets from my 1 to 15 hour real-time drawing tutorials over on Patreon for as little as $5 to $10 a month. Signing up gives you instant access to a library of tutorials for colored pencil, graphite, and soft pastel, with new ones added every month. I'll have a link to my Patreon in the description.